It's easy to think Watch Dogs 1 is a story rooted entirely in urban chaos, flashing screens, and citywide surveillance. But one part of Aiden Pearce's life that players almost never talk about sits far outside the concrete environment people associate with the game. Long before the events of Watch Dogs 1, Aiden spent portions of his childhood and teen years moving between relatives, small towns, and temporary homes. The game doesn't give us full cutscenes of this time, but it leaves small, overlooked breadcrumbs that completely reframe Aiden's personality. And these clues come not from Chicago, but from the quieter, rural outskirts of his upbringing. We know through in-game audio logs and notebook-style collectibles that Aiden didn't grow up in a stable environment. One detail most players skip is that he wasn't raised exclusively in a big city. Instead, he bounced around, spending years in smaller communities where he learned early on how to observe people, judge their intentions, and adapt quickly. This transient lifestyle forced him to rely on his own instincts instead of any real support system, and this is where his distrust of institutions first began. Long before CTOS ever existed, the irony is that his ability to navigate Chicago later in life comes from understanding what life looks like without any of that infrastructure. Another overlooked detail is that Aiden's fascination with technology didn't start in a high-tech environment. It started during those years outside major urban centers. One collectible mentions his uncle bringing home old electronics from job sites. These weren't advanced systems. They were scrap radios, broken appliances, and outdated computers Aiden learned by repairing junk, not by sitting in a modern workshop. This explains his improvisational hacking style in Watch Dogs 1. He's not a sleek, corporate-trained code expert. He's someone who grew up reverse engineering whatever he could get his hands on. That's why he thinks differently from characters like Clara or T-Bone. They were shaped by tech hubs and hacker circles. Aiden was shaped by isolation, boredom, and necessity. There's also the emotional aspect of those early rural or semi-rural years. Aiden's deep attachment to family, especially his fierce protectiveness, makes much more sense when we understand that he grew up without a consistent one. The stability he eventually found with his sister Nicole wasn't just comforting, it was the first anchor he'd ever had. That's why losing Lena, even indirectly, shatters him so profoundly. People often interpret Aiden as overly vengeful or cold. But when you overlay the reality of a childhood spent moving from place to place, with little structure or safety, his obsession with protecting what little family he had left becomes much more understandable. Even his self-imposed solitude in Watch Dogs, one ties back to these rarely discussed early experiences. Aiden learned early that forming attachments meant eventually losing them. He grew up watching temporary guardians, temporary towns, and temporary friends come and go. That conditioned him to stay detached, something that becomes painfully obvious in the way he interacts with DedSec, with Clara, and even with Jordy. When people think about Watch Dogs 1, they usually talk about Aiden's revenge story, DedSec's early operations, or the rise of CTOS. But one part of the game almost nobody talks about is the strange, unexplained way Aiden is able to predict human behavior, track patterns, and read people with an accuracy that seems almost impossible, even before he uses any hacking tools. And this isn't just a gameplay abstraction. The story quietly hints that Aiden has spent years studying people long before the game begins, developing skills that make him effective even without access to cameras or city data. You see this most clearly whenever the player is completely disconnected from CTOS. During missions where Aiden loses access to the grid, he still anticipates enemy movements, still reads crowds instinctively, and still identifies threats the moment he sees them. It's easy to overlook, but the game shows that Aiden doesn't rely on technology the way newer Watch Dogs protagonists do. His hacking is powerful, sure, but it's an extension of skills he already built by watching people, traveling, and building contacts, especially outside the city. The game hints that before he settled in Chicago, Aiden spent years drifting across smaller towns in the Midwest, learning how to navigate communities without any tech support at all. There are references to him pulling jobs in places where no surveillance system existed, meaning he had to rely on social engineering. manipulating people, blending in, and figuring out how individuals behave under pressure. This actually explains why Aiden is so effective in Watch Dogs 1 despite being only one person fighting massive corporations. He doesn't just hack machines, he hacks people. And the game gives small clues about this everywhere, in his criminal profiler notes, his reputation system, even the way NPCs react to him based on seemingly tiny changes in his behavior. Another overlooked detail is how Aiden understands criminal networks outside of Chicago. During the campaign, he names specific smuggling routes, gang structures, and crime families operating in states that the game never directly shows. That means Aiden wasn't just a street hustler. He was someone who traveled and built a map in his mind of how different organizations worked. When he arrives back in Chicago after Lena's death, it's not like he's learning a new system. He's returning to a network he's observed for over a decade. That's why Jordy calls him a tired old fixer. Aiden's been doing this far longer than the player realizes. This background also explains why Aiden doesn't trust anyone. His experience across multiple cities taught him that the most dangerous threats aren't the ones in front of you. They're the ones hiding in systems, in organizations, in the people who control information. So by the time Watch Dogs 1 begins, Aiden already believes that the only safe person is someone who knows everything. That's why he obsesses over data, why he reads every civilian he passes, why he tries to control every situation. It's not because he enjoys power.